Thank you, Lascion Corla, and may I begin by thanking all those who contributed to this private members' business debate over the last two nights. However, it is regrettable that the government should seek to reject this motion and replace it with what is fundamentally a deeply flawed amendment, one which buries its head in the sand and repeats once again that the banking fundamentals are sound when all the statistical information clearly demonstrates that there is indeed a crisis in the mortgage sector and that it is an issue of real systemic importance in the terms of the structure of this country. The government amendment, for instance, notes that the legal repossession of homeowners reported by institutions covered by the guarantee scheme amounts to 20 for the first 9 months of this year. However, we know that just this week that number has almost doubled, and that more importantly, legal repossessions are ultimately the final order and cannot be judged to be a true measure of the numbers of mortgages that are actually in difficulty and coming before the courts. Everyone knows that the main banks have put a halt to proceedings on repossession cases while the NAMA legislation and until it becomes fully operational. And it's also public knowledge that there are hundreds of cases pending and hundreds of cases will commence in the new year, and the letters are wrote. They're waiting for the stamps to be put on the envelopes and to be stuck out in the post. The government also, in their amendment, note that the number of homeowners in arrears, for instance for 90 days, with institutions covered by the state guarantee, is currently in the order of 15 to 16,000, as mentioned by my party leader, Eamon Gilmore, and claim that the rate of increases in arrears have moderated in the early months of this year. 15,000 households may be the figure in relation to the institutions covered by the state guarantee. That might be the number, 15,000. But this does not take into account the number of subprime lenders and other players in the market. These borrowers need and deserve to have their plight taken into account, and their numbers are actually potentially far greater than those potential defaulting borrowers within the state guarantee structure. The government also, in its amendment, makes note of the introduction of a statutory code of conduct for mortgage arrears. In theory, this all sounds fine. We've heard instances with Deputy White this evening where 100% mortgages are still being issued. So the question that must be asked is, where are the actual censures taking place for those failing to comply with the terms of conduct? They're not happening. There's no explanation as to how this code in its operation is actually policed and what the consequences are for non-compliance with it are. In effect, it's a code of conduct without any teeth. Much mention was also made of the renewed programme for government, which envisages expending mortgage supports. The time for envisaging has long well passed. What is required by people in fear of losing the roof over their heads is action and a fair playing pitch in the existing emergency that we are now in. People are suffering, and that suffering is real and present, and undermines the family life of tens of thousands of households. Promises for the future are of little value in the present, and ultimately progress for government, whether old or new, remind me of something that you have in the attic. You come across it, you say, that was useful, and then you forget about it again. That's the way that government and programme for governments actually are by this government. They're passing moments of thought. According to the ESRI, the estimated number of mortgage loans in negative equity by the end of 2009, and this was figures taken from research by my colleague Deputy Jack Wall, will be almost 120,000. In fact, the full scope of the ESRI's estimation suggests that by the end of 2009, depending upon the individual house price, there could actually be anything between 116,000 and 188,000 mortgages in negative equity just by the end of this year. So much for the fundamentals being sound, Minister. In reply to a parliamentary question that I asked to the Minister for Social Welfare earlier this week with regard to mortgage interest supplement applications, the figures show that for the month of August and September of this year, there were 1,123 and 1,245 claims registered respectively. Now, much mention has been made on the government side with regard to mortgage interest relief over the last two nights. As mentioned last evening, there are in excess of 14,000 people who received mortgage interest supplement this year, an increase of 200% since 2007. Now, while the mortgage interest relief programme does provide some relief for households, it is not a solution in itself. and it falls short of what is actually required. And what is required is what is outlined in the Labour Party's motion. Labour's motion before the House tonight is a real opportunity to address that hardship in a real and measurable way. It is an opportunity to clearly demonstrate to hard-pressed mortgage payers that this House, by means of legislation, is committed to achieving equity and fairness for homeowners. Now, at the core of the government's resistance, and I've heard the bleeding comments of Fianna Fáil backbenchers here this evening, but at the core of their Fianna Fáil's resistance to accepting the Labour Party motion is an issue of perception, as mentioned earlier. When Minister Manzara spoke last evening, he said there is already a perception of risk in connection with high Irish banks' mortgage loans books that is higher than is justified. He then went on to say that it is essential, therefore, that nothing be done to raise further fears about the quality of mortgage loan books. No, whatever one might think about Ireland at the moment, the idea that there might, it's like some Victorian comment that you might read in a Dickens book, that the lady's demeanour might be disposed to something, the idea that the Irish banking reputation might be affected by extending a moratorium for a 2-year period is a nonsense. The Irish banking institution in the real world knows that the banks are bust and have been bust for a long time. They have liabilities that are 4 to 5 times their actual asset base. That's a busted flush, Minister. That's what it is. So don't be talking about the bank's reputations. There is no basis for this contention, as suggested last evening by the government, that the 24-month accommodation will create any risk of unfavourable perceptions in the markets about Irish banking lending. Ultimately, what the government amendment here this evening is about the government being more concerned about its friends in the banks than the plight of distressed borrowers. That's what it's about. And the Labour Party also has been suggested by government, has been accused of talking up the problem. The reality is that the government are in denial of the reality of 35,000 households which are currently in mortgage arrears, and you are trying to talk down the problem. The government mantra tonight is the same as on the night of the bank guarantee. The fundamentals are sound. Don't worry about it. All the measures are actually in place. Now, I talk about talking. If you want to talk about talking about property values, the only talking that was done, I remember in April 2006, and I conclude this comment, Minister. In April 2006, I remember then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern coming on the 6 o'clock news on a Friday night and telling people to go out and buy their houses because they're going to keep going up. You were talking of the property market back then. Now, to conclude, Laskin Corla, it may have been beyond reasonable expectation to have expected the government to accept what the Labour Party is proposing this evening. However, what was expected, at a minimum, was that the government would recognise the extent of the problem and come forward with real and meaningful measures. This was not the case, and the Labour Party will be rejecting the government's amendments this evening. The problem before us is a complex one, requiring many significant measures to be carried out, and for these to be based within a legislative framework. The Labour Party's motion calling for a 2-year moratorium on family home repossessions, along with the provision of a national home mortgage service to assist mortgage holders in difficulties, is presented as a first-stage approach, putting in place structures and processes in order to establish security of tenure for the residential property market for homeowners who are distressed. Having listened carefully to contributions from both sides of the House during this debate, I am driven to the conclusion that a viable, robust mortgage modification programme can only be delivered by means of a statutory legislative code, and one that requires the need for a national home mortgage service. Laskin Corla, I commend this motion to the House.